When we're dealing with defensiveness, that is really a key thing when it comes to feedback, okay, or how we navigate through the feedback conversation. We also want to address how to deal with people who are often defensive. And one of the great benefits of the feedback model is that we can actually minimize feelings of defensiveness. If the other has stayed on their side of the net, okay, then they're sharing their reaction to your behavior. Okay. It is not a judgment of your character. So as long as both of you, okay, are very clear, you're very adroit in trying to navigate through the conversations regarding feedback, then you know that the conversation is about behavior. It's not making a complete judgment about your intention. Okay. And therefore defensiveness would be minimized. Okay. Now, you can still feel defensive somewhat, but you don't see it as a total rejection of who you are. Okay, I mean, there are times that people might be defensive. Okay, now this speaks to the difference of being defensive and having to defend oneself. Okay, those are two different things. Okay, now if somebody makes an accusation that you think is inaccurate, is it being defensive to correct them? Well, if somebody misunderstands you, is it defensive to explain yourself more accurately? If you're attacked, isn't it appropriate to defend yourself? Okay, so there are differences between being defensive versus having to defend yourself. The problem might not be defensiveness, but its side effects, so to speak. Being defensive, okay, or having that instinct to be defensive actually blocks your ability to hear feedback. It blocks your ability to be curious. And all of these things hamper any potential for growth. Okay. You might quickly dismiss the feedback with explanations, try to rationalize certain things, even if you've heard it. When you think the feedback is exaggerated, defensiveness can keep you from exploring what aspects might have some validity. Remember, feedback, there's data in it, okay? But not everything need not be false. At the same time, not everything need to be true. Of course, feedback conversations are just the start. They're just the beginning. Okay, it's not the end in itself. So you try to explore, and being defensive prevents you from going through that exploration. Now, dismissing feedback as completely wrong results in defensiveness that blocks you from wanting to explore why the other person feels the way about you. So, how can you accept your feelings of defensiveness without the limiting consequences of defensiveness? Well, look at defensiveness not as a binary construct, but something more of like a continuum. Okay. On one end, you can be so defensive because you're overwhelmed with so much emotion that you can't hear the other person. At the same time, on the other end, you might feel so indifferent. Okay, but it doesn't really matter what they tell you. You just one ear in, another ear out. Okay. Uh, but more times than not, when you feel defensive, it's not that extreme, right? It's not at that point where you're zoning out, you're not hearing the other person. It's possible that okay, you're still receiving something from the other person, but you feel some sort of a twitch inside you that makes you feel uncomfortable. Okay, you can still hear and deal with what someone is telling you. Now, acknowledge the feeling, acknowledge that awkwardness, that feeling of insecurity, perhaps, or that feeling of anxiety. Whatever it is that you're feeling, acknowledge that feeling and hold back your tendency to be defensive, to retaliate. Instead, try to understand what the other is saying. Be curious, ask questions, not in an abrasive manner, but really be curious. What is it you're saying? Can you explain more? Tell me more. Okay. Set aside the need to be right. Okay. I'm right. He's wrong. No. Set that aside for a moment. Try to understand what that person is saying. Because it's possible that other person is also struggling to express himself or herself. And yet that person is making a huge step in making it known to you as to what makes him or her feel uncomfortable about your current relationship. The important issue at that moment is the feedback that the other is giving, not defending your ego. Now, what if you give feedback and the other person appears to be defensive? Okay, so let's switch roles. Well, the same conditions apply. If you see the other person is emotionally flooded, you can say, okay, you're concerned. Okay, acknowledge the feeling. Okay, And then ask, politely ask, is this something that you want to talk about now? Or would you like to take a break? But definitely don't push it out for a long period of time. Okay. And do come back to it. Okay. Now, if it's having a lot of impact on the other person, then I think it's important that you raise that issue. Okay. More frequently, people respond to feedback in ways that sound defensive. Now, sometimes they say, wait, I don't do that all the time. Or the reason I do this is because of that. Okay. At that point, the one who gave the feedback rather, tends to, okay, step back, slide down. Okay, maybe it's not a bad thing. But if you think about it, it doesn't solve anything. Okay. So being defensive tries to explain away certain things, but it doesn't resolve the issue. Furthermore, being defensive is an implicit way of putting down what the other is actually feeling, to the effect that that other person is not acknowledging what the emotions of the giver of the feedback is currently feeling at that moment. Okay. Now, it's possible also that your assumption could be wrong. Now, so sometimes that person tried to justify. Okay. Maybe that's also not correct. So use that opportunity to really understand and resolve why this person is making that. Try to get a better picture, a clearer view as to why this person is making that rebuttal. Now consider what would happen if they didn't push back at all. Okay, and they become defensive. Okay, for example, they even thank you for giving you the feedback. Okay, sometimes we ask ourselves, do you really believe them? Is this person faking it just to close the conversation? Or is it possible that, again, one ear in, another ear out? Okay. Uh, that's possible. Okay. But of course, we want to give the benefit of the doubt, and don't back off. And don't really try to understand that if the defensiveness is not there, or if you're expecting some defensiveness but it didn't show itself, try to find ways to really confirm, okay, that okay, the other person really got your feedback very well. Okay. um, and I'm sure, in some cases also, people who've perhaps gone through these battles eventually would understand the need to be not defensive, so that makes things a lot simpler. Of course, the best test is to really find out later on if the situation recurs again. Okay. Now, whether you are giving or receiving feedback, defensiveness is often a sign that there is a truth to the feedback, right? And therefore, there is something worth exploring. Okay. Now, we find that often to be true. Okay. If somebody attacks you with something that doesn't resonate, any defensiveness can be short lived. But if your defensiveness lingers, okay, then there's usually something from the accusation that is really hitting you correctly. Okay. It might be something that you don't like to admit, but it's there. Explore further. Recognize, and once you recognize that, that actually gives you choices on how to respond. Okay? So what's important is really coming to terms with the fact that okay, certain things are probably true. And if you're a little bit more honest about yourselves, then maybe that will also be a start of making more progress in you coming up with a resolution to your situation.